Hello, and thank you for joining us tonight on the Capitol Report on NTD television. I'm your host, Melina Weiskup, in for Steve Lance this week. Here's a look at some of the top stories of today. The U.S. is levying a fresh wave of sanctions on Russia. It comes as world leaders gather in Brussels. But what did they say was another major concern besides Russia? Are these sanctions enough to hold Russia accountable and deter China from invading Taiwan? NTD's Steve Lance sits down with Congressman James Comer to discuss. And China wants to help prop up Russia's economy, but the White House has a plan of action to prevent China from helping Russia avoid these sanctions. We have the details for you. The White House has taken some action this year to hold China accountable for their human rights abuses. But what more could be done? We'll hear from Congressman Dan Bishop. President Biden is in Brussels today meeting with world leaders. What are their latest action plans towards Russia? And who else are they warning as the war drags on? NTD's Iris Tao has more.
World leaders are gathering in Brussels to plan their next steps on Russia. And during the unprecedented one-day trio of NATO, G7 and EU summits, President Biden announced a fresh wave of U.S. sanctions. They target over 600 Russian lawmakers, elites, and defense companies, which he said
that fuel the Russian war machine.
The U.S. is also giving $1 billion in humanitarian aid to Ukraine and will admit 100,000 refugees fleeing the country,
with a focus on reuniting families.
And that's adding to $2 billion worth of military equipment.
And our weapons are flowing into Ukraine as I speak.
But more concerns are rising.
And allies are deploying additional chemical and biological and nuclear defenses to reinforce our existing and new battle groups.
NATO says it's bolstering its eastern flank and preparing for chemical, biological, and nuclear threats. Meanwhile, another key concern the leaders are discussing is China.
China must not provide economic or military support for the Russian invasion.
But that doesn't mean the West is worry-free. In a potential warning to China, G7 and the EU are vowing to punish any attempt to help Russia evade sanctions. And NATO members are discussing setting up a system
whereby we have an organization looking at who has violated any of the sanctions and where and when and how they violated them.
And after the meetings today, President Biden will travel to Poland. He's also expected to announce a major move tomorrow to reduce European dependence on Russian oil, potentially by shipping liquefied natural gas, or LNG, to Europe. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Iris Tao, NTD News.
And to discuss Biden's trip overseas and how the administration has warned China about propping up Russia, your regular host Steve Lance sat down with Congressman James Comer today. Here's their discussion on these pressing issues.
Congressman James Comer, thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report.
My pleasure.
Congressman, I want to ask you, today President Biden has announced new sanctions and further aid for Ukraine. Sanctions on Russia, further aid for Ukraine. Do you think that European allies and European countries are carrying their fair share right now? And what do you think should be done?
I don't think they're carrying their fair share now. I think it's getting better, but they're still buying oil from Russia. That needs to stop. That's hopefully the message that Joe Biden's giving in Europe right now. That's the least they can do. We're going to all have to have shared sacrifice. I do believe that we're finally getting weapons into Ukraine and aid to Ukraine. I think the private sector stepped up. I know the government stepped up. So hopefully that aid will be beneficial.
Now, in his recent talks, President Biden with Chairman Xi of China, the White House said that President Biden described the consequences that would take place if China continued or does provide support with to Russia. Do you believe that the Chinese regime is taking the U.S. warning seriously?
Well, I hope so. I want to believe they will. But unfortunately, I don't think Joe Biden's had a very good first year in office. I think the debacle in Afghanistan really hurt his standing on the world stage. Hopefully this will change. Hopefully his words will resonate with China. But thus far in the first year of the Biden administration, I think it's safe to say that China doesn't have a lot of fear of Joe Biden, not the same type of fear that they had of Donald Trump.
Now, if China were to take action in Taiwan, do you think the United States should and will help Taiwan militarily?
Well, you know, again, I thought after Afghanistan, our days were finished with helping other countries with massive amounts of foreign aid and military assistance. But that changed with Ukraine. I've been surprised by the outpouring of support from my congressional district of people wanting to support the Ukrainians. I don't know if there will be that same type of help for Taiwan, but as you know, we have a much more critical relationship with Taiwan from an economic development standpoint in the United States. So there are a lot of problems in the world, and unfortunately leadership matters. I think that Joe Biden made a lot of mistakes in the first year of office that have put us where we are on the world stage now, with the crises in Ukraine, with the potential crises in Taiwan, and then who knows what's going to happen in Iran. I'm nervous anytime someone from the Biden administration goes over to Iran and negotiates anything with them. So, you know, I sincerely hope Joe Biden's successful in negotiations with world leaders, but thus far I don't think anybody's been impressed with his first year in office.
Congressman James Comer, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And while all of these sanctions that are imposed on Russia are meant to cripple its economy, China is suspected to be actively trying to help fill that void. A China ambassador this week urged Chinese businessmen to waste no time and fill the void in the Russian economy. But the U.S. and other countries aim to prevent this. The White House immediately responded, warning China not to help Russia get around these sanctions. The U.S. and G7 are unified in stopping this. Together, they will soon announce a unified initiative to prevent systematic sanctions busting. The Biden administration is also prepared to enforce export controls if Chinese companies send semiconductors to Russia. The Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, explains that all Chinese semiconductor companies rely on the U.S. software to manufacture these tiny chips. Raimondo warns, quote, "If we find that they are selling chips to Russia, then we can essentially shut them down by denying them use of that software, and we're absolutely prepared to do that." But there's more that needs to be done to hold China accountable, House Republicans say. At their retreat this week, the GOP is calling on the Biden administration to do more to hold China accountable.
Do not let China corner markets. When you look at what happened in America, just from our medical supply, when you look what China is doing when it comes to critical minerals, when you look time and again what China has done on stealing our technology.
And the chairman of the China Task Force, Michael McCall, is urging the administration to learn from the Ukraine invasion to avoid a similar scenario in Taiwan.
Moving forward, we can't make the same mistake of not arming Taiwan like we didn't arm Ukraine in advance.
Republicans have also been pushing for the administration to investigate the origins of the CCP virus.
How can we have hundreds of thousands of Americans killed by COVID, but a government that will not look and know where the origins have created?
They also want to hold China accountable for its cover-up when the outbreak first began. The Biden administration has taken some action to crack down on China's human rights abuses. One of those actions was sanctioning Chinese Communist Party officials. To discuss this, Steve Lance sat down with Congressman Dan Bishop.
Congressman Dan Bishop, thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for the time.
Congressman, the State Department recently sanctioned some Chinese officials over persecution that they're conducting overseas in China. With that said, should the U.S. government be taking more steps to hold China and Chinese officials accountable for all of their crimes?
To be sure, China is the most significant geopolitical adversary for the United States. That's something that President Trump, I think, spent a full administration illustrating for the American people to great effect. I don't think anybody really differs with that now. But the question then becomes what we do. And I think we need to confront China in many ways, but certainly their human rights violations against Uyghurs, for example, many others. Yeah, I've been supportive of every action taken in the House and believe we should do more.
Now, President Biden is heading over, if he's not already there right now, to Europe to visit some of the NATO allies. This is probably the most critical overseas trip of his presidency. What message do you expect him to send to the NATO alliance and European allies?
Look, I wish him the best because the president abroad speaks for the country, but unfortunately, the situation he's in is almost untenable, thanks in no small part to his own weakness in the way he's conducted foreign affairs. If you can go back to Afghanistan, the utter incompetence displayed in that withdrawal, you can draw a direct line to the circumstance we now face with the grave threat to European security in the situation with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the President now needs to pivot and begin demonstrating strength. And that's a hard thing to do when you've shown as much weakness as we unfortunately have. Senator Cruz has made the point, and I think he's right, that you can also look to President Biden's dropping of the sanctions on Nord Stream 2 pipeline and Putin's belief that that would soon be online as opening the door to him to commit this aggression in Ukraine. So we've got to see a turn, a pivot from the weakness that Biden has demonstrated thus far.
Do you think there's any lessons to be learned in terms of taking preemptive, firm action to some of these despots around the world, especially when it comes to China?
I think you have to take the right action, but you need to show strength. Now, and so, I think I, for one, have sounded the note that even in Congress, once the war drums begin pounding, you've still got to proceed with deliberation and reason. We passed a bill on Russian and Belarusian trade relations a week ago. I voted no. I was one of 8 Republicans who voted no because that bill contained unprecedented expansion of executive power, both in terms of granting the power unilateral to the President permanently in effect to set trade tariffs for those nations, and also an elimination of the sunset on the Magnitsky Act and an expansion and reduction of the standards governing the President's ability to sanction foreign persons anywhere in the world. We can't keep handing blank checks, but the President and the Congress need to be prepared to confront threats to freedom in the world and show us a steel resolve and be prepared to act along with our fellow nations.
Congressman Dan Bishop, thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Former President Donald Trump today sued Hillary Clinton and several other Democrats, alleging they tried to rig the 2016 U.S. presidential election by tying his campaign to Russia. The lawsuit was filed in federal court in Florida. It says Clinton and ex-British spy Christopher Steele, along with around 30 others, carried out a plot to weave a false narrative that Trump was colluding with Russian actors. The 108-page complaint states falsifying evidence, deceiving law enforcement, and exploiting access to highly sensitive data sources are so outrageous and subversive that even the events of Watergate pale in comparison. Besides Clinton, Steele, and the Democratic National Committee, defendants in the lawsuit also include former FBI officials James Comer and Andrew McCabe. The complaint seeks damages and a jury trial. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki condemns North Korea for testing a long-range ballistic missile that landed near Japan. The Japanese government says the missile flew further than the previous ones and was capable of reaching the U.S. East Coast. After flying for over an hour, the missile landed within 100 miles of the Japanese island of Hokkaido. Psaki says this launch is a brazen violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions and needlessly destabilizes the security in the region. She adds that the door has not closed on diplomacy, but urges all countries to hold North Korea accountable. Jobless claims are coming in at a 5-decade low, and U.S. unemployment is also dropping. We'll take a look at the Labor Department's latest report. U.S. airlines are saying that pandemic restriction rules imposed on travelers are now outdated. They're asking President Biden to lift certain mandates. The Biden administration is now starting to relax pandemic restrictions in other areas. Will they lift the pandemic restrictions for handling migrants crossing the border? There's a bottleneck at the border that could lead to a massive number or tens of thousands of illegal immigrants flooding the border at the beginning of April. That's if the administration lifts the Title 42 immigration policy. Title 42 is a policy created during the start of the CCP virus pandemic. It allows Border Patrol agents to deny entry to migrants without considering their asylum claims to prevent the spread of COVID-19. The White House will either lift this policy or extend it by the end of the month. Meanwhile, immigration experts warn there's now a bottleneck of around 170,000 refugees that's built up at the southern border after being turned away under Title 42. And some lawmakers are asking how the administration is preparing for this. A letter led by Senator Rick Scott and signed by 13 others was sent today to the Secretary of Homeland Security, asking him how they'll deal with the expected surge. The Republican senators ask if the administration is gathering information about it and if they are prepared to send National Guard troops or extra police to help mitigate the surge. And the Supreme Court did not say whether Justice Clarence Thomas is still in the hospital. Last Friday, he had flu-like symptoms and was diagnosed with an infection, but the court said Thomas did not have COVID. He was expected to be released by Tuesday. The CEOs of major U.S. airlines are asking President Biden to drop federal pandemic requirements for air travelers. They sent a letter to Biden saying that masking for air travelers no longer makes sense and is, quote, not aligned with the realities of the current environment. The CEOs are also asking to do away with the testing requirement. Right now, travelers must show a negative COVID-19 test result before boarding a flight into the U.S. The letter quotes the World Health Organization as saying that pre-flight testing was ineffective. They also note that Europe dropped the testing requirement and the U.S. should do the same. Unemployment is now dropping. New jobless claims and the number of people already collecting unemployment benefits came in last week, at the lowest rate in 5 decades. The Labor Department's latest report shows that new jobless claims have dropped by 28,000. Last week, there were around 187,000 new claims. That's the lowest level since 1969. And the number of those collecting unemployment benefits fell by 67,000. There's now just over 1 million people collecting unemployment. These drops signal there's less layoffs and more people are returning to work. Employers added close to 680,000 jobs last month. Most job growth was in the hospitality and leisure sector. Children and families from across the nation will once again gather on the south lawn of the White House for egg rolling, storytelling, and fun activities. The White House announced today the 2022 Easter Egg Roll will be held on Monday, April 18th. Tickets are free and will be made available via an online lottery. Lottery results will be announced on April 7th. The White House Easter egg roll was canceled for the past 2 years due to pandemic lockdowns. And that's all we have for you tonight on the Capitol Report. Thank you for tuning in. From Washington, D.C., I'm Melina Weiskup, and we'll see you tomorrow.